I would consider it a complete and total betrayal of my parents' martyrdom during World War II, were I to be inclusive of baby killers. You are the extremists. You are the fringe. I am not the fringe. You are the fringe. Israel is the fringe. Israel's defenders are the fringe. Don't appease, because you'll never win. Because the issue is not anti-Semitism. The issue is Israel and the class war.
Welcome to the Big Picture Podcast. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today we speak with Professor Norman Finkelstein. Finkelstein is a political scientist and one of the world's foremost scholars on Israel-Palestine, as well as a critic of culture and empire. He's the author of The Holocaust Industry, and most recently, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. Professor, welcome back to the Big Picture.
Thank you for having me.
We're speaking today in the aftermath of a devastating 12-day war between Israel and Iran and the United States. It was a war that Iran had tried to keep at bay, and that one that Israel had long been planning to launch. In its aftermath, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel was changing the face of the Middle East. Not only that, he also said that Israel was changing the face of the world. What do you make of this statement? Do you think he is accurate in what he's saying, or is it merely hubris?
Well, obviously, things have significantly changed since October 7th, and it'll be difficult to assess the magnitude or the endurance of the changes because it's on so many fronts. There is the military front, there's the public opinion front, there is the legal front, there is the directly political front in places that where the conflict reverberated. For example, which I know we'll get to later, there is a connection between what happened after October 7th and the victory of Zohran Mamdani in New York. It's inescapably the fact that the city, which was considered what might call a Jewish stronghold in the world, the highest proportion of billionaires is on the Upper East Side in New York City. The Upper East Side is the richest strip of land in the world. And there's a large number, probably a preponderance, who are Jewish, and for a double reason feared Zohran Mamdani. First of all, because they want Israel, they want to make New York safe for Israel. And secondly, they want to make New York safe for billionaires. Probably the billionaires comes first, making New York safe for Israel comes second. And they poured in huge amounts of money. They outspent Mamdani about 30-1. The estimates are that the billionaire class poured between $25 and $30 million in Andrew Cuomo's campaign. Mamdani spent 1.2 million. And the billionaire class, the Upper East Side, the Jewish supremacist billionaires, were defeated. And that's not supposed to happen in New York City. And in part, we can't gauge exactly how much, but in part, it's because it's now legitimate to launch I wouldn't call it a severe critique of Israel. I would call it a mainstream critique outside the lunatic confines of the Jewish supremacist billionaire class and their organs, the APAC, the New York Times, the Atlantic magazine. Outside that bubble, that lunatic Jewish supremacist bubble, what Zoran Mamdani was saying is what Human Rights Watch says, what Amnesty International says, what the International Court of Justice says. But up until October 7th, that view was delegitimized in a place like New York, in the columns of the New York Times and the mainstream media. And October 7th and its aftermath, the Israeli genocide in Gaza and its aftermath, legitimized the mainstream discourse in the rest of the world. Zohran Mamdani is not off the spectrum. For the rest of the world, he's off the spectrum for New York City and the United States in general. So that's another repercussion. The radical shift in public opinion. I'll just, um, there were many commentators who said that's not supposed to happen in New York City. One guy I thought, I guess his name is Saul Reckler, and he's a real estate mogul. And he said, New York is the capital of capitalism.
Mm.
How did you get a democratic socialist being elected here? That's not supposed to happen. And New York, as you know, is the most populous Jewish city in the world. Some people say it might be Tel Aviv, but that's if you include the suburbs. But it's quite likely to be, it's quite probably the most populous Jewish city in the world. And Jews exercise at every level of government and civic affairs. They exercise a degree of power commensurate with their population. And the billionaire class and the Jewish supremacist class, they suffered a major defeat. Now, overwhelmingly, it was due to Mamdani's, Zohar Mamdani's campaign of affordability. No question that was the key issue. But the important point is his views on Israel did not disqualify him, did not delegitimize him. I can't tell you because you wouldn't believe it. I received in the mail. I live in an old Jewish neighborhood, so they were targeting my neighborhood, the anti-Mamdani people. If you see this, I received 7 in 1 week, 7 pieces of campaign literature this size in my mailbox, which said, Mamdani's an anti-Semite. Mamdani's a radical Islam. We've got to stop Mamdani. We've got to stop Mamdani.
Do you have any
I've
with you
never,
that you can show us?
you know what? I'll tell you what happened. You'll excuse me for going on at length. I was so incensed by this campaign against Mamdani that's what drove me on the last day. I thought I had finished campaigning for him. I went out several days. But on the last day, I said, no, I do not like the fact that they are buying the election, the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. So I took the 6 pieces of literature I had received that day, I received another one the next day. 6 pieces of literature I received that day. And when I went out campaigning for him, we were outside the 7th Avenue stop in Brooklyn of the Q and the B line, for those who know New York City. And I would tell people, in my opinion, this is a very simple election. It's as simple as you get. The election is about, do you believe the city belongs to the Upper East Side, or do you believe the city belongs to all of us? And then I took out the campaign literature and I said, this is what I found in my mailbox. This is a question of, do you believe in plutocracy, ruled by the rich, or do you believe in democracy, ruled by the people? I said, uh, this, this you could disagree with Mamdani on this issue, you could disagree on that issue, disagree on this issue, that's fine. But this is not really about the issues anymore. This is about who the city belongs to. And as that real estate mogul Reckler put it, this is the capital of capitalism. So it should belong to the capitalists.
Mm.
It should belong to the billionaire class. That's what he was saying. And so I would show them, I said, look at these leaflets I got in my mailbox. I got one finally yesterday after the election was over. I got one in support of Mamdani. No, you know what? I read it too quickly. It wasn't in support of Mamdani, actually. I don't think so. My memory's a little fuzzy on that. Um, so I would show the people, I said, this election is being bought, is being purchased. And one person laughed because I was giving out campaign literature. And I ended up giving one person one of the 6 uh, anti-Mamdani uh, pieces of literature because I was holding them together. I had campaign literature from Mamdani, and I was also showing those items I got in my mailbox. You know, we have to stop Mamdani. We have to stop Mamdani. Um, and I accidentally gave them the wrong piece of literature. I gave them the anti-Mamdani literature because I had confused I had confused the 2 piles.
So you are
So
simultaneously
everybody,
campaigning for Mamdani and against him.
yeah, yeah. Um, so that the fact that his stance on Israel, which was now he's beginning to waver a little. I hope he won't disappoint hopes, but he defended, globalized the Intifada,
Mm.
which was it was a audacious thing to do. He didn't back away. Uh, and he defended describing what's happening in Gaza as a genocide. Uh, as I said, outside the lunatic bubble of the the Jewish supremacist billionaires, that's not that's not a radical position. It's become the mainstream
Mm.
position. Oh, he also defended BDS. Um, so that's another repercussion of October 7th. So, in answer to your original question, and this was a huge digression, it's very difficult at this point in time to assess all of the repercussions of what happened on October 7th. Certainly, some of uh, Mr. Netanyahu's boasting is warranted, but we have to, I think, remember the the origins of what's now about 21 months. In my opinion, and I doubt we'll ever know for sure, the Hamas leadership, what it did on October 7th, was a throw of the dice.
Mm.
it was obvious the trajectory of where things were headed, that eventually Saudi Arabia would join in with the so-called Abraham Accords, and Gaza was left to be forgotten. And there was no way at that point in time to stop the juggernaut. It was Gaza was being left to languish in uh, per misery in perpetuity. So they did a throw of the dice. Was it was there grand planning? No, there was a certain amount of what you call tactical sophistication, much higher level than anybody would have expected from Hamas. There were many more gaps in Israeli intelligence and technology than was understood before October 7th. But as in general, it was a throw of the dice, and the other components of what's called the axis of resistance were not happy with it. I think one of the most telling uh, comments by Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, one of the most telling comments was, "We weren't informed of this.
Hmm.
They warn us, and they couldn't possibly have approved of it because Nasrallah, remember, General Secretary Said Nasrallah, um, he was the Hezbollah military chief from for about 30 years. And this person got up in the morning, sipped his tea while reading all the press briefings, all the security briefings. He knew Israel very well. And if you remember his next to last speech or his last speech, I can't remember, he said, "We have to be honest. Israel has the technological edge." So, fact number one, they weren't informed. Fact number two, Saeed Nasrallah, among other things, a military commander of some stature, he knew they weren't ready. They weren't ready for an all-out confrontation with Israel. And if they had a say, because there were very people like Nasrallah and the Iranian leadership, they were very rational, lucid. In the case of the Iranians, very conservative, uh, conservative actors. They would never have approved that, not because they thought it was immoral. That's not an element in the equation. They weren't ready for what was coming. So, to repeat myself, and you'll forgive me, I hope, it was a throw of the dice. And everything that happened thereafter, hard to predict. Uh, I got many things wrong. I think I got more right than anyone else. If you go back and look at my first statements from October 8th on, when I was interviewed on the subject, I would say 95% holds up of how I analyze the situation. but I got things wrong. I think I was wrong, and here Professor Chomsky uh, was correct. We had conversations about Hezbollah, and he said, I don't believe they're a significant military factor. I don't believe Israel fears them. He was right. I was wrong. It proved to be much easier to disable Hezbollah than I would have guessed. Um, it's unclear whether it has actually been disabled or whether because of the sensitivities of Lebanese politics, they just couldn't do more than they did.
Mm.
But plainly, they proved to be a much less formidable force than at least I had imagined. Um, I would say what happened in Gaza, it came as a surprise, not the genocide itself. It came as a surprise that how easily the world acquiesced in it. I would have thought that there would have been more red lines than actually came to be. There were heroic attempts by the South Africans to mobilize international moral opinion and legal opinion. It came to very little, not in any way to denigrate their undertaking, but it came to very little. Um, and by the end, I think it's correct to say, since you were asking about the consequences, another consequence I believe is it marked the complete and total. I know those are big words, but those are uh, large words. It marked the complete and total disintegration of the UN system,
Mm.
not just the genocide, but more so. I won't say more so, but in addition, the fact that Israel and the United States both launched wars of aggression um, with total and complete impunity. The most brazen, outrageous breaches of Article 2 of the UN Charter. And uh, there hasn't yet been any question of accountability, none whatsoever, which means, I don't know how old you are, and sometimes I forget how much time has elapsed. When George Bush Sr.,
Mm.
when he launched what was called the first Gulf War in 1991, one of his marks of statesmanship, it was said at the time, he and Secretary of State James Baker, was it James Baker? Secretary of State, I can't remember now. Uh, I'm trying to remember. Just check who was the Secretary of State with George Bush.
It is James Baker.
James Baker. One of the marks of their statesmanship was that they had managed to get through the resolutions in the UN. There were seven. My memory is pretty clear on that. Seven resolutions between August 2nd, 1990, I guess it was March 1991 when they launched the first Gulf War. But it was a sign of finesse and sophistication that they had managed to line up the whole Security Council. The only exception was Yemen. I don't know if I think Yemen may have abstained. No, Yemen voted no. It was famous because James Baker went to the Yemeni delegation, the head of the delegation, and he said, quote, "That's the most expensive vote you will ever cast
Mm.
in the United Nations," meaning you are going to be punished for that vote because they wanted unanimity, but they got 14-1. So it was a point of pride that you had unified the UN Security Council behind this military uh, undertaking. Now, come the second war in 2003, Bush had been unsuccessful in gaining support. The French and the Germans both opposed it, which was a disaster. The only one supporting it was Tony Blair. But there was, as you remember, how do you remember 2003?
Very clearly, yes. Yeah, that was
Okay,
the moment that I became politically aware.
right. You will remember the buildup to that war was marked by, quote, the largest, biggest anti-war demonstrations in human history. That's what was said at the time. The largest, the biggest anti-war demonstrations in human history. Um, but now you had the Israeli the aggression against Iran, followed by a second aggression by the United States. And the issue of international legality has not even come up.
Hmm.
Do you see it? These are pretty open and shut cases.
Hmm.
You know, what Israel and the United States did, these are the most brazen, outrageous, unabashed um, breaches of the UN Charter. No reaction at all. There was an article on the front page of the New York Times. That's a comical newspaper. It's a comical newspaper. Does Israel have a legal defense for what it did? Oh, that's a very controversial question. Did Israel have the legal right to launch an attack on Iran? Oh, very complicated legal question.
Hmm.
If you live in that lunatic bubble, if you live in that lunatic bubble. So I think that marks the, you could have said 2003, you could say maybe it was an aberration. You could call it maybe an aberration. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Blair, the Dracula. You could see the fangs on Blair. He's a looks just like Boris Karloff Dracula. Um, you could call it maybe it was an aberration. It was one, as I said, the precedent to 2003 was 1990, where the whole UN was lined up. I'm not saying what was done was right, but I'm just saying, at least formally, there was a pretense of going through the motions of getting approval from the UN Security Council, according to the charter. Uh, this time there was no pretense. 2003, it didn't, they tried. Remember, Bush tried
Mm.
to line up. international support. He failed, but he tried. This time there was not even an attempt. It was just so brazen.
And there were months of lead up to
So
that
I
as well.
think,
That there were reports, there was a back and forth, there was questioning, there was an idea that slowly the media in the West was coalescing to the demands of the government, and it felt like when the war actually happened that it was almost inevitable at that point. There was literally a countdown, I remember, on CNN every single day to the invasion of Baghdad, and yet this time around all of this happened so quickly, and the
and
media in the
with
United
so
States
little,
coalesced so quickly to the narrative that it was kind of insane to watch.
and it was so little resistance, popular resistance. Remember, 2003, largest, biggest demonstrations in human history. The day before the attack on Iran, I think it was the day, yes, the day before, there was a demonstration in, or maybe the day after, no, not my memory, so I can't remember now. No, I think it was before. Um, uh, there was a demonstration against an attack on Iran in New York. I expected hundreds of thousands. Oh no, it was after because it was an emergency demonstration. I expected hundreds of thousands would show up. Do you know how many people were there? About 400. Less, less. The demonstration was so small. It was so small. I'm a slow walker. Before you knew it, I was at the back of the demonstration, and I was part of the Israeli counter demonstration. Serious. There are photographs of me more marching with the Israeli flags because it was so small.
I'm sure they were surprised to see you
Before
there.
you, what?
I'm sure they were
Oh,
surprised to see you there.
they had some amusing remarks. Let's just put it that way. Um, so there was not even. I did have to ask myself, what happened from 19 from 2003, a million people to 400. What happened? Um, but to return to your question, I said the repercussions in the mayoral candidacy and then the repercussions in the international legal order. The uh, what happened with the Israeli US attack has now opened the door wide to any state launching an attack at any moment on any pretext or with any pretense. There's no legal. I know it sounds dramatic, but I think it's factually correct. The simultaneous Israeli US attacks on Iran without any uh, public reaction as to their legality. Obviously, there was public reaction about what happened. Will it lead to a escalation? Will there be a war? Yes, that happened, but with no public reckoning of the legality, in my opinion, signals the international legal order died on those days. It no longer is functional. Now, I know the skeptic will say it was never functional, and yeah, there's truth to that, but there was pretense. There was pretense. Has anybody even posed the question, should Israel and the US be held in violation of, in breach of the UN Charter? It's not even come up. Did Gutierrez say anything about that? The Secretary General of the UN? Has anyone said anything? Wait, wasn't the charter just breached? No. So that's another consequence. Um, a lot happened. And we shouldn't forget, because it's easy now to forget, Israel was determined on October 8th to implement the final solution to the Gaza question. It was not going to be any more operations. We have exhausted the suite of operations. There were so many operations with so many lunatic names by that lunatic state. If I were to just, if you give me a half second, just to give you, since 2004, Operation Rainbow, Operation Days of Penitence, this is all against Gaza.
Mm.
Operation Summer Rains, Operation Autumn Clouds, Operation Hot Winter, and then came Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge, Operation, I forgot the one in 2021, what it was called.
Pillar of Cloud, I think.
Um,
Pillar of Defense.
well, that was
There's a lot of pillars.
2012. 2021, um, uh, let me just, in any event, Israel had decided that there would be no more operations in Gaza. We found the pretext, we found the excuse, and after October 7th, they were going to solve for once and for all the Gaza question. Um, and they made that very clear for those who wanted to listen. The invocation of Amalek by Mr. Netanyahu, the claim by President Herzog that there are no civilians in Gaza, the order issued by Defense Minister Gallant, no food, water, fuel, or electricity will be admitted to Gaza. That was an outright genocidal plan. Now, there were two aspects that need to be taken into account. One aspect is that there were, at least at the beginning, there were limitations on what Israel could do because of international public opinion. So they sealed off Gaza, no food, water, fuel, or electricity. That order was given, I think, October 9th by Gallant. And it held up until around the 15th, when the United States began to signal to Israel, you have to pull back a little because this is not looking good. And so there were fluctuations in the application of the genocidal plan. There were fluctuations, and the fluctuations were mostly due to pressures, external pressures. So, for example, when Israel killed on April 1st the 8 members of the World Central Kitchen, that caused problems to them because you're not supposed to kill Westerners. And so they then allowed more humanitarian aid in because of the pressures that were exerted by international public opinion. Uh, Secondly, the Israeli plan had three components, three aspects. They kind of overlapped. One was the ethnic cleansing, which proved unworkable when the Arab states vetoed expelling the entire population to the Sinai. Secondly, to make Gaza unlivable, that succeeded. and thirdly, to carry out a mass extermination along the lines defined by the Genocide Convention of 1948. So I would say the plan had different components. There was a genocidal element to the plan, but it also had an ethnic cleansing component and a more long-term genocidal goal of making Gaza unlivable. Um, and Mr. Netanyahu, he knows the American media very well. That's I would call it his forte. He knows when he has to hold back and when he has the green light to go in for the kill. Once the media was distracted by the Iran question,
Mm-hmm.
uh, right now it's it's just an outright, unconstrained, untrammeled genocide. 2 months, all food, fuel, water, and electricity was not allowed in. Then they cleared out the whole humanitarian mechanism for Gaza. They created this Frankenstein monster called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They opened up 3 distribution centers in the south, one in central Gaza, none in the north, forced the hungry, starving, famished Gaza population to move all the way to the south, or that one distribution center in the center, none in the north. And then it was pure sadism. We could sit here, talk about it, but really it would require a novelist, a novelist to capture the sadism of this. I can't find the word monstrous, pathological. It's very hard to capture it. I'm telling you honestly, and here I'm speaking personally, I'm not speaking as a professor.
Mm.
Not that I was ever much of a professor, I never had a job, but not speaking, somebody who studied the conflict. Um, I often wonder, were the Nazis worse? Who was worse? Under the Nazi regime, you wouldn't know this, you'd have to have studied it. The army, they were the extermination of the Jews was supposed to be carried out in a very objective scientific way. Like it was supposed to be, it was not supposed to be done with glee. It was not supposed to be done with relish. And believe it or not, you'll find this kind of funny in a weird sort of way. Many Nazi soldiers were prosecuted for sadism. Now you say to yourself, what are you talking about? They lined up people and put them in gas chambers and
Mm.
then, exterminated them. Isn't that sadism? Well, they didn't think it was sadism because they thought it was being done in a very objective, scientific way.
Almost an
You weren't
emotionless way.
allowed. Why?
Almost an emotionless way.
Yeah, you're supposed to do it in an emotionless way. That was the whole point.
Mm.
So, there were, I'm not saying a large number, but there were prosecutions for sadism. But with the Israelis, it's done with this kind of sadistic glee. It's the only image that keeps leaping to my mind. It's a mousetrap. You have these famished, starving people. You promise them a little cheese at these so-called, they're like the they're like the showers in Auschwitz. You promise them a little cheese, and then when you get there, the Israeli army shoots them. Gleefully, gleefully. People don't want to hear that. But remember what the opposition leader in Israel said. Now, this is the opposition leader. He said, our soldiers are killing children as a hobby. And he came under ferocious attack for that until finally he had to withdraw it. But that's true. Unfortunately, that's true. If you look at just the polling data, for 20 months, it was the data. I haven't seen the most recent data, but it was pretty consistent among Israeli Jews. 95% said Israel was using enough or too little force in Gaza. 40% said too little force. Only 5% of Israeli Jews said it was using too much force. Then there was the poll about 3 weeks ago, which found that half of Israelis, nearly half of Israeli Jews, support genocide in Gaza. It wasn't a very technical poll in the sense of you have to look up in the dictionary, what did they mean by genocide? No, we didn't have to look up what they had to say about what they meant by genocide. The question was, do you believe that when Israeli soldiers conquer a city, they should kill everybody in the city? That was the question. Not complicated. We don't need a dictionary. 47% of Israeli Jews said yes. Then there was another poll. This was done of all Israelis. Are there any innocents in Gaza, or is everybody a deserving target? It was 63% of all Israelis said no innocents. If you factor out Arab Israelis, it's about 70%. The reports by the doctors, which even the New York Times, which is basically an Israeli organ in New York, even the New York Times found credible to the point that they published an op-ed. Israeli soldiers were targeting children in the skull and in the chest. So to now come back to the point, once the distraction of Iran set in, Netanyahu realized this was the opportunity without any, as I said at the beginning, occasionally public opinion puts certain constraints on Israel, not much, but something like the March 28th order of the ICJ, March 28th, 2024, the order of the ICJ, and combined with the massacre of the members of the World Central Kitchen, that put a constraint on Israel, off and on. But once the Iran phase set in, no holds barred. Right now, as we speak, the numbers are the minimum numbers. The Israelis have killed 500 Gazans at the distribution center. Not distribution centers. They're not. They're mousetraps.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole thing is so ludicrous. You don't know it's one absurdity piled on another ludicrous situation. They go to these distribution centers and they're given these food packets, and the food packets contain items that have to be heated, but there's no fuel. There's no fuel. It's not even cheese. It's a mousetrap with fake cheese. There's it's just very hard to, and we're sitting here and you just read the reports. I don't I don't know. You know, when you get to evil, it's hard to gauge what's more evil. Is it more evil to conduct an extermination with scientific objectivity and emotionless, or is it more evil to carry it out with outward displays of sadism? Which is worse? Do you know what? I haven't a clue. I haven't a clue. That's for moral philosophers to ponder.
Hmm.
But there's something about it. I just, I'll tell you. So I've been reading about the claims of anti-Semitism on the college campuses because Harvard put out several reports on it, and it's being used as a pretext for this assault on academic freedom. And the Harvard report talks about how the Israeli the Israeli students on campus are being shunned, SHUNNED. They're being shunned. They're being avoided. They're being ostracized. And this is supposed to be proof positive of the anti-Semitism on the campuses. I'm thinking to myself, these are baby killers. What? I'm supposed to be, fancy words are, I'm supposed to be inclusive of them. I'm supposed to be pluralistic, pluralistic. I'm supposed to be pluralistic of them. I'm supposed to hang out with them at the pub. I try, believe me, I try in my classes, to the extent I'm allowed to teach, I try in my classes to be absolutely fair to every point of view. You would be very surprised how far I go to allow everybody to express his or her opinion on every subject. But speaking frankly, and I have to be careful with my words because it may prevent me from ever being teaching again, but I have to be honest about it. I would consider it a complete and total betrayal of my parents' martyrdom during World War II, were I to be inclusive of baby killers. Now, I recognize there is a problem there. As a teacher, it is a problem. I recognize that. And you know what? Professor Chomsky used to say that human affairs are so messy that there's no formula, there's no formulaic answer to many questions of human affairs. The dilemma I just pointed to, these Israeli students, they served in that army in some capacity, because they're coming straight out of the army when they go to college, in some capacity to facilitate, to enable, and in a large number of cases, to directly participate in a genocide, which has killed the number now, the number this morning in Haaretz, they're giving a figure, a plausible, a credible figure of 100,000 Gazans have been killed. Of those 100,000, about 56% are women and children. So you would estimate about a little more than 25% of that 100,000 are children. 25, about 25%, which would be about 25,000 children. I don't know what I would do with one of those students who came down to me at office hours. I have to be honest about that. It gets me in trouble professionally to say that.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, in the case of what's happened, I think the default position is guilty until proven innocent. If you served in Gaza, you were an enabler of genocide. What degree? I don't think it makes much difference. Let's say you didn't shoot the kid in the head. Let's say you just prevented food from going in so the kid starves to death. So when I read those stories, I can I say it? I think those monsters should be shunned. That's not being anti-Semitic. That's being a human being. I'm not going to be inclusive of the moral type that sent my parents' families into gas chambers. If after the war, somebody who staffed a gas chamber went to college, which is perfectly probable, not even possible, and I discovered that person in my class, should I be inclusive of that person? Should I be pluralistic? I think my late mother would throttle me. You get throttled if I claim to be inclusive, but I recognize that flies in the face. I recognize it. It flies in the face of my responsibility as a professor. I will be open to every point of view. I will encourage, and I do encourage, dissent in the class. I do encourage it to the point of playing a devil's advocate, which upsets many students because I am not politically correct. I am not woke. And I say things on subjects like abortion, which they don't like to hear, on subjects like affirmative action, which they don't like to hear, some of which I believe in, some of which I'm just doing my job to expose all points of view, and then you decide for yourself what's truth. I'm not here to decide truth. I'm here to give you the best argument, all sides, and then you run with it. You process it. You assimilate it as you will. So I have no problem with that. In fact, if it weren't for dissent, class would be very boring. When you go into these woke classes, they are so deadeningly boring because it's just a bunch of slogans, no thoughts, thoughtless. There's no thought. You can't have thought without conflict because conflict forces you to think out what's wrong with that argument. What's wrong with that argument? You know, that's what that's the raw material of thought, the conflict of opinions. Otherwise, no thought is going on. It's just rote. It's like 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. It's like the multiplication table. What causes thought is the conflict of ideas, where you're forced to wrestle with what's wrong with this argument, what's wrong with that argument, or what's right with this argument, and what's right with that argument. So, as a matter of principle, and also as a teacher who likes a mentally lively class, I want dissent. However, that all assumes the dissent is being done by people with clean hands. If it's a war criminal, who, because of our imperfect legal system, domestically and globally, isn't held accountable for his or her crimes, and then is sitting in my class, and I'm supposed to look past that? I can't. I can't look past that. You shot a kid in the head and you laughed about it. You targeted a kid in the chest and you joked about it. You blew up a hospital and you posted it on your social media and you were laughing. So now, as we speak, the genocide is its final phase because nobody's paying attention. All the talk is about Iran. So you asked a question approximately 1 hour ago, and we
and you answered a number of other
never
ones
got.
that I wanted to ask you. And I was about to ask you actually about Western culpability and the rule of law and this hypocrisy that we're seeing. But honestly, hearing you talk, and one of the things that I admire greatly about you is your ability to be self-reflective and to scrutinize your identity, your Jewish identity, scrutinize the memory of the Holocaust and the way that it gets used. Of course, you document this in much of your work. And that makes me think about myself, and it makes me think about the world that exists around Gaza, not in the West, but in the Middle East, and the role and the responsibility of many of us who come from that part of the world and who've been watching for the last 20 months, feeling helpless, feeling a sense of paralysis. And I kind of think about the incident that happened in 1982 in the Sabra and Shatilla Palestinian camps in Lebanon. That's often used as an example of one of the worst atrocities that the Israeli government had been a part of, which, just to give some context, was in the middle of the Lebanese civil war. It involved the Israeli army standing at the gates of these refugee camps, allowing the Palestinian Christian militias, the phalangists, to go in and wipe out everyone that was inside. The Lebanese Christians.
Yeah, well,
Sorry,
they didn't just
the
they didn't
Lebanese
just
Christian
allow
militias.
them. They escorted them from the airport to the camps, then let them in, then lit flares at night for them to have light to carry out the mass extermination. They knew exactly what was happening. they had guard towers. They were watching it. They knew exactly what was happening. And then the famous line by Menachem Begin, who was a typical shtetl, that means a little village in Eastern Europe. He had the mentality of a shtetl, a small town mentality. When the Sabra and Shatilla massacre happened, his famous line, I don't know how many of your listeners will even know Sabra and Shatilla. As you said, it was September 1982, was the end, towards the end of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, in which the estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. It was actually the biggest bloodletting until Gaza, after October 8th. The other, the other Israeli operations, they came to 1,000 killed, 2,000 killed. It was pale. It paled beside Sabra, beside the Lebanon War in 1982,
Mm.
where the numbers were 15 to 20,000. In any case, so when, as you said, they sent in the militias to carry out the mass executions, uh, and they blocked the gates, sent flares in the sky to facilitate the execution. And then when it happened, Menachem Begin said, quote, he was the prime minister at the time. He said, quote, the Goyim killed the Goyim and they blamed the Jews.
Hmm.
Goyim meaning not Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So as always, we're the victim.
Mm-hmm.
As always, we're the innocent victim. Goyim killed Goyim and they blame the Jews.
And so I,
That's the Israeli mentality.
when I think about that, and I think about the current moment that we're in, and if Gaza is a metaphor, if Sabra and Shatila was a metaphor for Gaza, and the Israelis are now the phalangists that are in there killing indiscriminately women and children and men, who right now is standing at that door? And I can only think about the rest of the region that sits in direct proximity to Gaza that could do a lot to stop what is going on right now, and for one reason or another has not. And I wonder what you make of that. You know, not the West, not the Western role to play here, but
You know,
the regional people, the leadership.
look, there was once something called the Arab Street, a kind of transnational Arab solidarity. It's gone. You want to hear the funniest thing? Um, these Gulf Arabs, you know, from this Bahrain, the signatories to the Abraham Accords. So some of them, they attend Harvard. And you know what? When you read the reports, as I was saying, they express disgust that Israelis are being discriminated against. You know, what kind of commentary? The Arab students go before these Jewish commissions to attest at how the poor Israelis are being discriminated against by the opponents of the genocide in Gaza. You have to laugh. You have to laugh. So pitiful. So pitiful. Like that Mahmoud Abbas. What a freak. What a human freak. He looks like Humpty Dumpty. He's a square. He's like Humpty Dumpty. I wish he would fall off the wall already and crack into 1,000 pieces. His every statement is just given to blaming Hamas. The money, it's all they think about. If we can get control of Gaza, we'll get more money for our Swiss bank accounts. That's all they care about. Nothing else. The greed. Well, so there isn't an Arab street anymore. The Arab street was the one veto under corrupt, depraved Arab leadership, but that veto was over. It was a very potent force. I wouldn't say very potent.
Hmm.
It put checks, it put limits. I could go through the history, but I'm too tired right now to do it. But there are many episodes where um, the PLO, the Palestinians, had what you might call symbolic power. They didn't have the material constituents of power. They didn't have an army. They didn't have an economy. Obviously, they didn't have oil. They didn't even have land. But they had a symbolic power because the cause of Palestine resonated with what was called the Arab street. So the Arab leaders always feared going too far in accommodating Israel because of the reverberations from that Arab street. And that was clear, for example, the best known case, at any rate to myself, is when Sadat wanted to sign the deal with Begin,
Mm-hmm.
what came to be called the Camp David Accord. He knew that he needed a fig leaf of support from the Arab world. Otherwise, he'd be completely ostracized. And Jimmy Carter understood that dilemma of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. And he went to Saudi Arabia and he begged the Saudis to approve of the deal, the Camp David Accord. He begged them. And the Saudis said, no, you have to give something to the Palestinians.
Hmm.
You have to give them something. Otherwise, they feared that Arab street. And Israel wouldn't budge on giving anything substantive to the Palestinians. And so Sadat was ostracized. You might recall he was kicked out of the Arab League after the Camp David Accord. And then he met his fate. It's an irony which Jimmy Carter would never admit to, but the irony is Jimmy Carter, who counted Sadat as a very dear friend, a close friend, um, Jimmy Carter signed Sadat's death certificate
Hmm.
when he cut the deal at Camp David. It was only a matter of time before Sadat was going to be assassinated. But now there's no fear anymore of an Arab street. There's nothing. Of course, Saudis want something, just give us a little fig leaf, would give something to the Palestinians, but you can throw the Palestinians a couple of sacks of flour. The Saudis will claim credit for it and then sign the deal. They don't. There's no fear anymore of an Arab street. So that's another casualty of there was no Arabs. Look, there was more solidarity. Okay, with the partial exception of Hezbollah, and of course the noble exception of the Houthis, with um, the partial exception of Hezbollah, which was in a very tight situation. Uh, it can only escalate so far before Israel attacks, and then the whole Lebanon turns on Hezbollah because they don't want a war with Israel, least of all over Gaza. And the Houthis, who played a noble role to the extent that they were able to. There was more solidarity from South Africa
Mm-hmm.
than any Arab state. There was more solidarity from South Africa than from any Arab state. It's a fact. So, another consequence of this a desperate throw of the dice by Hamas on October 7th. Um, that's where we stand now.
And it's hard to think that we live in the same world that we did on October 6th. And from what we understand of Hamas's reasoning is that they wanted to change a lot of how the world around them works in that act of desperation, as you said. And now it feels like 20 months on, there are two different worlds that we now occupy. Just a month ago, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, gave this very impassioned speech to his Western counterparts and said that the rules-based order that was built and put in place by the West, by Europe and the United States, was in danger of collapsing if these Western leaders didn't stand up and prove that it still existed. And then, of course, he was referring at the time to the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state and unilaterally and imposing restrictions on Israel. And then just weeks later, as soon as Israel launched that attack on Iran, France was alongside all of their Western counterparts in re-emphasizing that statement that now has become a cliche, which is Israel has a right to defend itself, despite the fact that they, of course, had initiated the war. But now it feels like we live in a world where a lot of these leaders are not really pretending to abide by these rules any longer, or at least they're giving them lip service, but they don't really seem to be very serious about them. And of course, we don't believe that
actually, I have to correct you on one point.
Please.
They're not giving it lip service anymore. They don't even pretend the wars are legal. It's not even part of the calculus anymore.
Which feels new. It feels
the
different.
Expression hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue.
Mm-hmm.
They're not being hypocritical anymore.
And yet
they're not pretending
there's a public there that's in the streets it started in the streets and now feels like it extends to a very large swathe of the public that, 2 years ago, you could have argued that a lot of the public in the West didn't really understand what was happening in Palestine, didn't really understand what was happening in Gaza. I think there's a very small minority of people in the world now that doesn't have a very clear picture of what's happening, and that includes a lot of these leaders. And yet it feels like what is happening in these halls of power and what the reality is could not be further apart. And as you mentioned, that lip service now is something that feels like it is a thing of the past. And what happens now that we have this reality where we have very good ideas about what is happening in the ground in a place like Gaza and at these so-called aid depots where people are being gunned down just to try and get food. While the world watches, we watch the genocide happening over the last 2 years, and nothing has happened. There has been absolutely no sense of repercussion whatsoever. No real attempts at trying to bring it to an end. What kind of world do we now exist in, and what is the consequence of that? Not only in Gaza, not only in the region, but around the world, in our own cities in the West that we live in. What do you think the consequence of that is?
As I said, there are many fronts. Which one do you look at? There was the horror, and then there's no, as I've said many times, there's no silver lining in a genocide. Period. Full stop. If I were to try to convince my parents, yes, what you passed through was horrible, but look, you ended up in the United States. You lived a relatively decent life. You raised 3 children. None of them wanted for hunger, for a roof over their head. So maybe it wasn't all that terrible what happened. My parents, Throttle me. There's no silver lining in a genocide. Full stop. The only thing one can say is there were, I can't find the right expression without trying to prettify something. I would say that Mamdani could not have been elected were it not for Gaza.
Hmm.
There was no possibility. Things like that happened. Um, I don't want to say what the overall balance sheet is because, first of all, I don't think you can calculate it. I don't think you can calculate the overall balance sheet. And secondly, I don't want a balance sheet with genocide. A balance sheet is credits and debits. You try to balance.
Hmm.
I don't want to place genocide in a balance sheet. I don't want to. I don't want to go there. Again, speaking on a very strictly personal basis, that would be a betrayal, an act of treason against my parents' martyrdom. So I don't want to go there of trying to come to a bottom line. I don't want to go there. So I just will say, uh, and I don't even know, honestly, I don't know how long it will last. This awareness, how long it will last, I'm a little doubtful it'll last. Remember, or not that you should know, the defining uh, the defining experience of my generation was the war in Vietnam. And the estimates are 2 million Vietnamese were killed by the United States and about roughly a million Laotians and somewhere along that number of Cambodians. 4 million people were exterminated by the United States. Now, Vietnam is one of our strongest allies in Southeast Asia. And the Vietnamese never talk about the war. People forget. Whether will there be a Gaza consciousness next year? Sorry to say, I think there's a good chance it'll be completely forgotten. So whether the change that occurred, as they call it, the change in consciousness will endure, I'm skeptical. I've lived long enough to watch events which seemed epochal at the time to vanish into nothingness. And you know what? When they vanish, it's very hard to maintain your indignation because it starts to feel artificial. It starts to feel like you're faking it because the feelings behind it have also dissipated, evaporated. Uh, that's it. Okay,
Can I
that's the story, my friend.
can I ask you
And
to end quickly by talking about Zohran Mamdani and just to bring the conversation to a full circle and just taking a look at how much of a threat he is perceived by a lot of people in the political class in the U.S. and as well as in the media, because he's been attacked from every angle over the last couple of days, and the attacks are vicious, and I think it betrays a sense that a lot of people feel threatened by what he represents and what the generation that has voted him in potentially represents. And I wonder what you think about that.
well, that's a large question, and I don't have the time to go through it in the detail that it warrants. I would say that Mamdani, he represents almost in a pure form the class struggle. You know, the famous line by Karl Marx in the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. The first line is, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Mm.
The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. And we're seeing in the Mamdani campaign, it's clearing the air. If you remember when the Bernie Sanders challenge to the existing system emerged, it got the powers that be tried to confuse the stakes. So all of these woke people, they started to criticize Bernie for being weak on the Black question, weak on racism, weak on reparations, weak on the women question. They said Bernie bros.
Mm-hmm.
That was how they called it. That was all men, all white men. Of course, Bernie's campaign was all about the class struggle. Every night when he came out, it was attacking the billionaire class. It was attacking Goldman Sachs. It was attacking big pharma. But both the Republican and the Democratic Party both tried to obscure what was going on by turning it into an identity politics struggle. So the Republicans represented the oppressed white working class
Mm-hmm.
who are being oppressed by identity politics, you know, and affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion. And the Democratic Party tried to turn it into also an identity politics campaign. We represent Black people, Mexican, Hispanic people, sexual minorities. So each of them pretended they wanted to obscure the real issue. The real issue was a class struggle.
Mm.
And Bernie was very emphatic about that. Now with Mamdani, that sort of identity politics is not going to stick with him. You can't say a fellow named Mamdani is weak on um, race questions,
Mm-hmm.
ethnic questions, religious questions. It's not going to work. So it's a straight out class struggle. His campaign was just like Bernie's. Uh, Bernie's was about affordability, and that's Zoran Mamdani's about affordability. But in this case, you can't use any of the woke weapons against him because his name is Zoran Mamdani. He's clearly not a old white male, you know. So it's a clear-cut class struggle. They're very scared of it because the remember, the other side has the money, they have the power, they have the organization, but one thing they don't have, they don't have the numbers. And in a democracy, a formal democracy, one person, one vote, that's a problem. They don't have the numbers. The numbers aren't even close. And now the primary, they brought to bear their money. Bloomberg, just Bloomberg, Michael Bloomberg, a former mayor of New
Mm-hmm.
York, a Jewish supremacist billionaire, he gave Cuomo $8.3 million. And as I said, your mailboxes were stuffed with, we have to stop Mamdani. We have to stop Mamdani. Anti-Semitism. They were literally jam-packed, the mailboxes. Didn't work. The numbers are coming back to haunt them. It's not what the Occupy movement said. It's not 99%. Remember the slogan of the Occupy movement, we are the 99%. It's closer to 80%. 80% is a lot. 80% are the losers in this system. 80% are the folks who have gig jobs, what are called, gigs. Three people they have three gigs, no vacation, no health care, no pension, no future, no nothing. That's about 80% of our city. Um, so they're worried, and it's very predictable. I predicted the first day. I knew exactly. I sent people the email. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to buy out all of the opposition candidates, the three main opposition candidates. Not any of your viewers should know or would know, would be Curtis Sliwa, who is the Republican nominee, Eric Adams, the current mayor of New York, and possibly Andrew Cuomo. It's still unclear.
Mm.
So they were going to buy out all except one. And they're all crooks, Eric Adams, Andrew Cuomo, they're crooks from the day go. So it's easy to buy them off, a bribe here, a bribe there. So they'll narrow it down to one versus one. Exactly what Obama and the Democratic Party leadership did after South Carolina. You remember Obama picked up the phone, get Buttigieg out, told him, you don't drop out, no future in the party.
Mm.
Called up Amy Klobuchar, don't drop out, no future in the party. And then it came down to Biden versus Bernie. And that's when it was over. Because up until that point, the mainstream Democrats were divided. It was Elizabeth, even at the end, it was Elizabeth Warren, Biden, Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar. So step number one, get rid of the other candidates. And now step number two, it's perfectly obvious what's going to happen. It's what they did with Jeremy Corbyn. With Jeremy Corbyn, it began in the UK with the Labour Party. It began with the Jewish Board of Deputies attacking him on anti-Semitism. And the issue was for them, I mean, the Jewish Board of Deputies are basically a fifth column. They are foreign agents of the state of Israel. They should register as foreign agents, but of course, they're not going to be asked to because then it's a trope. Jewish, you're claiming that Jews have dual loyalty, a trope, they call it. I hate that word. It's just a stupid word. Uh, so they're foreign agents, they're agents of the Israeli government. In any event, so they started with the anti-Semitism, and then what happened? The whole British ruling elite, they latched onto it. From BBC to Sky News, from the Guardian newspaper to the tabloids in the UK, they all latched on to the anti-Semitism. Not that they cared about anti-Semitism, the
Mm.
Board of Deputies cared. True, not anti-Semitism, the Board of Deputies cared that Corbyn was not aligned with Israel. So they wanted to stop Corbyn for only one reason, Israel, the Jewish Board of Deputies, because they're Israeli agents. But then the whole ruling class, because they didn't want Corbyn, he represented the real insurgency. He was another a class struggle, was the class struggle. So they all exploited the anti-Semitism to stop Corbyn. And it did play a role. It wasn't the critical role. The critical role, judging by all the information we have, the critical role was Brexit, that Corbyn was not firm on the Brexit issue, Britain leaving the European Union. But the anti-Semitism played a role. The assault attack played a role. And so now in New York, they'll find one candidate and they're going to go after Mamdani on the anti-Semitism issue.
Do you think it'll be as effective?
And It all depends on him. My counsel, which hasn't been solicited, but I'll just tell you, don't appease because he'll never win. If you remember the Corbyn campaign, he made one concession after another concession after another concession. The party adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is basically any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. They gave in on that. Did it help them? Did the juggernaut suddenly stop? You can't appease them because the issue is not anti-Semitism. The issue is Israel and the class war. They are not going to let Zohran Mamdani, even if he gets circumcised, gets a bar mitzvah,
I mean, he's Muslim,
and
so
does
I
the
assume that he is circumcised.
yeah, yeah, right. I recognize that, but you get the point.
Yeah.
Um, so they will never he will never placate them. He should, in my opinion, he should stand firm in his convictions. He should surround himself with an iron wall of Jews who support him and let them do the hard work of fighting off these Jewish supremacist billionaires. And there are a sufficient number of young Jews who support Zorani, and
Many
he
that have been
should make,
canvassing for him quite actively as well.
excuse me?
And many of them have been canvassing quite actively for him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And he should make the point over and over and over again. I am not the extremist. I am in the mainstream. I go with what Amnesty International has to say. I go with what Human Rights Watch has to say. I go with what the International Court of Justice has to say. I go with what international law has to say. I go with what a large number of Holocaust scholars or genocide scholars, including Israeli genocide scholars. I go with what they have to say. You are the extremists. You are the fringe. I am not the fringe. You are the fringe. Israel is the fringe. Israel's defenders are the fringe. I am not. That should be his strategy. No appeasement, no attempt to placate. Surround yourself with an iron wall of Jews who support you and let them make the case and make the point over and over again. I am not the extremist. You are. You're the ones defending what the International Court of Justice decided was a plausible genocide. I'm opposing that plausible genocide. You are the extremists, not me. That strategy it's not going to win Jews. Or I should say, it won't win the older generation of Jews. It'll probably win about 30% of the younger generation. I would estimate it about 30% of the younger generation. So that's what I would recommend to him. If he starts appeasing them, number one, it'll never work. And you know what's going to happen? Number two, it'll disillusion his base. They'll say he's already betraying his convictions and he hasn't yet even been elected. And it'll dissipate the enthusiasm. So it'll be a disaster we already know it. We know it from the Corbyn campaign. It'll be a disaster if he goes down that path. I don't know what he'll do. I'm sure, right now, the Jewish mafia like Gerald Nadler in New York, he's saying he's supporting Mamdani. No. Gerald Nadler has a very long history of being a grotesque apologist for Israel. Um, but his aim is to try to persuade from within. And there'll be a lot of sweet talking, a lot of talk about being reasonable, about Jewish fears, and, using all of that language. And I don't know how he'll stand up. It's it's too soon to tell. So far, he's done well, I would say. Um, the two comparisons that are being made with him are with Barack Obama and with AOC, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But the comparisons are completely wrong. First of all, Obama had no program at all. He said it himself. If you read his autobiography, he said, he quoted a neat trick. I stood for nothing. He said that.
Hmm.
I stood for nothing. It was a neat trick, he said. And secondly, Obama ran with the money. The billionaire class supported Obama. They gave him huge amounts of money from beginning in Chicago. The Pritzker family, which is one of the richest families in Chicago, they backed Obama. Zohran Mamdani, he had a very concrete program. People called it crazy. Free buses, free childcare. But there was a very concrete program there. It's not Obama, a neat trick. And secondly, Mamdani ran against the money. He was outspent 30-1 by the billionaire class. So that's not Obama. And it's not AOC, because AOC got elected before anyone knew what her politics were. It was a kind of fluke. It was all done at a very local level. Mamdani had to face the tough questions before he won the primary. They were hammering him already about the anti-Semitism. They were hammering him about his tax the rich, and how can you do that because the laws don't allow you to. He was already being, AOC faced no opposition. There was a very old guy who was in her district. He didn't even know what was going on. He was completely detached. But with Cuomo versus Mamdani, they knew what was going on. Everybody understood what was going on. This is a class war. And that's why we're giving him $25 to $30 million. This is serious business. Because as Mr. Reckler said, this is the capital of capitalism. You don't run a socialist candidate here. So he faced the opposition already, which AOC was basically below the radar when she got elected. So it's not AOC, and it's not Obama. It's a very different. The closest thing is obviously Bernie, with the obvious difference. Well, it's not yet obvious difference because we don't know who will win in November. I think it'll be a tough battle, but it's a battle which, frankly, I relish because the identity politics is dead now. You can't use that. All the woke people like Angela Davis and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Gloria Steinem, all the woke people who attacked Bernie, that's over. You can't do that with Mamdani. It's not going to work. So it's going to be a clear class struggle. But of course, the other side is going to try to misrepresent it as it's an issue of anti-Semitism.
Mm.
That's what they'll try to do. But everybody understands what's going on. I mean, they're just very, the ruling class, they're very straightforward. They say we've got to stop this guy. you read the front page of the Times. They says all these business leaders got together with Eric Adams. We got to stop this guy. They're not so much afraid of him. No, they're afraid of the movement. The electorate is supposed to be passive, and they should choose among the candidates that we decided. You remember what the New York Times wrote in the editorial? They said Mamdani should not even have a line on the ballot. Can you hear that? On the primary ballot. There were a large number of people running in the primary. They said he shouldn't even have a line on the primary ballot. They couldn't have felt very well when they discovered their influence now is down to about zero. Nobody gave a damn what the New York, in my day, a New York Times endorsement, at least in New York City politics, decided the election. It was a very fraught moment. The New York Times editorial, who it endorsed. Yes, it was a very big moment. Even when you knew who they were going to endorse, it was still a solemn occasion, that New York Times editorial, who it's endorsing. Now nobody gives a shit. A darn. They've lost all credibility. Good thing. That's a good thing.
Professor Norman Finkelstein, I deeply appreciate your time. It's been a far-reaching conversation. And of course, we're keeping an eye on the New York politics. Everyone in the world seems to be watching what happens in this mayoral race. There is, I think, a lot of hope being placed on this one individual, but more so on the generation of people that are uplifting him and what it says about the world and what many of us hope that the world is versus what we are shown often that it is in reality. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you putting things into perspective for us, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Okay, nice to talk to you.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to Norman Finkelstein for being our guest today. You can check out the last 2 interviews that we did with him on The Big Picture in our playlist as well. We would love to hear your thoughts on this far-reaching conversation, whether it's about Zohran Mamdani's democratic election win, or it's about what is happening in Gaza, or it's about the aftermath of the Israel-Iran war. So please leave your thoughts in the comments below. As always, you can find this episode wherever you get your podcasts if you would like to hear it, and all of our other episodes in audio format. And as always, my name is Mohammed Hassan. Salam.